This recording wasn't released to go viral. It was released to force decisions. Because when 50 Cent lets a moment like that play raw, uncomfortable, unfiltered, it's not emotion slipping out. It's pressure being applied. And when that moment becomes the opening beat of a documentary that ties Rick Ross and Sean Diddy Combs into the same timeline, the message is unmistakable. This story wasn't ready years ago. It's ready now because now the consequences actually matter. For a long time, the industry treated 50 Cent, Rick Ross, and Diddy as separate narratives, different lanes, different power levels, different eras. But 50 Cent's new documentary does something the culture avoided for years. It connects them, not through gossip or speculation, but through moments and reactions that don't need explanation to feel heavy. This isn't loud exposure, it's controlled exposure. Before we go any further, answer this honestly. Do you think 50 Cent is exposing the truth about Rick Ross and Diddy, or is he applying pressure to force something long hidden into the open? Tell me in the comments, and if you want real documentary-style breakdowns without the noise, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. What separates this documentary from every viral clip online is restraint. 50 Cent doesn't rush to explain what the audience should think. He lets discomfort do the work. The opening isn't about accusations or timelines, it's about fracture. A moment where composure breaks just enough to signal that something underneath has been weighing on people longer than they admitted. Only after that does the documentary widen its frame. Rick Ross is shown at the height of confidence, business booming, image locked in, narrative accepted without resistance. Diddy appears not as a headline maker, but as a constant presence in the background of power. And 50 Cent sits apart from both silent, observant, underestimated. According to people involved in the project, this contrast isn't accidental. It's the foundation of the story. The documentary revisits Rick Ross' rise with precision, not to challenge his success, but to examine how his story became unquestioned. Interviews from the past replay on screen, consistent, confident, carefully framed. The filmmakers don't call them false. They place them next to context that makes them feel incomplete. In hip-hop, repetition often becomes truth. And once a truth is accepted, few people ask what it's protecting. This is where Diddy's role becomes unavoidable. Former industry insiders describe Diddy as someone whose influence rarely needed explanation. Being near him created opportunity. Being distant removed it. The documentary doesn't claim he orchestrated outcomes. It raises a quieter, more uncomfortable question. How many narratives survive simply because questioning them felt unnecessary or unsafe? As these connections form, the focus returns to 50 Cent, and the difference in approach becomes clear. While others managed image publicly, 50 watched privately. He didn't challenge stories in real time. He let them settle. According to longtime collaborators, he believed pressure works best when it's delayed, when assumptions have hardened and contradictions land heavier. Then the shift happens, without rollout, without warning. The recording surfaces, not framed as a diss, not followed by explanation, just released. The documentary makes this point unmistakable. This wasn't impulse. The recording existed long before it appeared, and that delay is what gave it power. Media analysts explain that early exposure gets dismissed. Timed exposure forces recalculation. The reaction wasn't chaos, it was restraint. Executives paused. Conversations moved off record. People connected to Rick Ross and Diddy didn't rush to respond, they waited. And that waiting matters. Crisis experts explain that when people are confident there's nothing more to uncover, they speak quickly. When they aren't sure, silence becomes strategy. From there, the documentary shifts its focus to impact, not speculation. Old interviews are replayed. Past statements feel different under new context. Rick Ross's earlier comments about distance and independence now invite scrutiny without being accused of deception. Diddy's long-standing silence, once read as authority, begins to feel calculated. Legal analysts slow the pace intentionally at this point. They explain that recordings don't destabilize situations because of what they prove, but because of what they disrupt: credibility, distance, control. Once those fracture, everything built on them becomes vulnerable. And this is the line the documentary draws clearly. This is not about one clip. It's not about one rivalry. It's about why this story stayed quiet for so long and why it couldn't stay quiet anymore. By the time this section ends, the viewer understands the shift. The industry isn't reacting to what was released. It's reacting to what might already exist. And that uncertainty is doing more damage than any accusation ever could. Because if 50 Cent was willing to release this, then the real question isn't whether Rick Ross or Diddy are uncomfortable. It's how long they knew this moment was coming. The documentary doesn't rush to answer that question. Instead, it pivots sharply into the first real escalation. This is where the story stops being theoretical and starts carrying risk. The film introduces what insiders call the reaction window, the short period after the recording surfaced, when decisions had to be made quietly and quickly. Not public statements, not interviews, decisions. According to multiple people interviewed, this was the moment when uncertainty became a liability. Nobody knew if what surfaced was the full extent of what existed or just a signal. And that uncertainty changed behavior almost overnight. One media strategist describes it bluntly. When people believe more material might exist, they don't defend, they distance. The documentary backs this up with a sequence of subtle but telling shifts. Meetings that were scheduled suddenly postponed. Appearances quietly rescheduled. Conversations that once happened openly now routed through legal teams. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, but enough to indicate recalibration. This is where Rick Ross' position becomes more fragile. The documentary revisits Ross's long-standing insistence that certain associations were exaggerated, transactional, or distant. Those statements aren't challenged outright. Instead, they're placed next to newly surfaced context, not accusations, but contradictions. The effect is deliberate. Viewers aren't told Ross lied. They're shown why people are now re-listening. Then comes the first mini-shock. Midway through this section, the documentary introduces a previously unseen industry exchange, not the recording itself, but the aftermath. Messages between executives discussing risk exposure. Not morality, not truth. Risk. The language is clinical, but the implication is loud. Ross's name isn't flagged for what he did. It's flagged for what could become complicated if scrutiny expands. This reframes the entire situation. The documentary makes clear that in high-level entertainment, reputations don't collapse because of guilt. They stall because of uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads faster than facts. One analyst explains that brands don't wait for clarity, they wait for quiet. When quiet disappears, caution replaces confidence. At the same time, Diddy's silence takes on new meaning. The film contrasts earlier periods where Diddy's lack of response signaled control with the present moment, where silence feels tactical. Legal experts explain why this matters. In situations involving overlapping civil and federal exposure, any statement can create risk. Saying nothing becomes the safest move, even if that silence invites speculation. But the documentary doesn't let that silence sit unexamined. Former associates describe how access to Diddy changed during this period. Not cut off, narrowed. Conversations moved to smaller circles. Trusted intermediaries replaced direct communication. One insider calls it containment without collapse. The system still functioned, but with guardrails suddenly visible. The story then pulls back to 50 Cent's role again, not to center him emotionally, but strategically. According to people close to him, this was the outcome he expected. Not chaos, pressure, enough pressure to force movement without triggering open warfare. The documentary suggests that releasing the recording wasn't meant to end anything, it was meant to start recalculation. And recalculation is exactly what followed. Industry veterans explain how quickly alliances thin when ambiguity enters the room. Support becomes conditional. Neutrality becomes common. Public loyalty fades without explanation. The documentary shows examples of this shift, not through statements, but through absence. Missed collaborations, delayed announcements, projects quietly moving forward without familiar names attached. What makes this phase uncomfortable is its subtlety. There's no villain monologue, no explosive confrontation. Just systems responding to risk the way systems always do, by minimizing exposure. As the section nears its end, the documentary introduces a second, quieter shock. An attorney explains that once a recording like this surfaces publicly, It changes how all related material is evaluated. Things once considered irrelevant get re-examined. Old footage, archived communications, even rumors that never gained traction can suddenly feel worth revisiting. That's the real escalation. Not what's already out, but what's now vulnerable to scrutiny. By the time this chapter closes, the viewer understands that the situation has moved beyond personalities. This is no longer about whether Rick Ross or Diddy respond publicly. It's about how institutions behave when certainty disappears, and as the pressure continues to build, one realization becomes unavoidable. The most dangerous part of this story isn't what's been released, it's what the industry is now preparing for. That preparation phase becomes the most revealing part of the documentary, because it exposes something the public rarely sees: how power behaves when it senses vulnerability. Not panic, not denial, adjustment. The narrative shifts into the legal gravity surrounding everything now in motion. Attorneys, investigators, and former prosecutors explain that once a piece of material like this becomes public, it doesn't live in isolation. It reframes context. Statements that once felt unrelated begin to matter. Timelines tighten. Associations that were previously considered background noise move closer to the foreground. This is where stories stop being cultural and start becoming procedural. For Sean Diddy Combs, this convergence is especially significant. The documentary carefully outlines the legal environment he's operating in: ongoing civil matters, federal scrutiny, and the cumulative weight of allegations that span years. It does not accuse. It does not speculate outcomes. Instead, it explains mechanics. Legal experts note that when multiple narratives begin overlapping, even indirectly, they amplify risk. Not because they prove wrongdoing, but because they reduce ambiguity. And ambiguity is what powerful figures rely on most. One former investigator puts it plainly: power doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes when explanations stop working. The documentary highlights how often Diddy's name appears across different proceedings, depositions, and testimonies connected to broader industry investigations. Not always centrally, not always accusatorily, but consistently. The filmmakers are careful to remind viewers that repetition is not guilt. Yet they also make another point: repetition forces attention, and attention changes how institutions behave. At the same time, Rick Ross's position continues to shift in a different but related way. The documentary stresses that Ross is not being framed as legally exposed in the same sense. Instead, the risk surrounding him is reputational and strategic. Analysts explain that once an artist's narrative becomes unstable, every decision attached to that narrative becomes heavier. Endorsements, partnerships, collaborations, silence. In that context, doesn't neutralize scrutiny, it prolongs it. The film shows how Ross's earlier insistence on distance now feels less like clarification and more like insulation. Again, no accusation is made, but the contrast is impossible to miss. Statements that once felt definitive now feel conditional when replayed against new awareness. This is where the documentary introduces one of its most important ideas. Systems don't collapse under truth, they collapse under uncertainty. Industry veterans describe how uncertainty forces risk-averse behavior. Brands pause. Networks hesitate. Executives ask questions they didn't ask before, and those questions don't need answers to cause disruption. The act of asking is enough. One strategist explains that once uncertainty enters a brand's orbit, every future move is evaluated through a defensive lens. The story then circles back to 50 Cent, not as an instigator, but as a variable others can't control. People close to him describe his approach as deliberately minimal. No interviews explaining intent, no victory laps, no escalation. According to the documentary, that restraint is what keeps pressure active. When nothing new is said, attention doesn't dissipate, it concentrates. Everyone waits. And waiting in this context is exhausting. The film contrasts this with past industry conflicts where constant responses diluted impact. Here, the absence of commentary becomes the commentary. Analysts point out that this tactic leaves others with fewer options. Responding risks saying too much. Staying silent risks appearing cornered. Either way, movement is forced. As this section unfolds, the documentary widens its scope beyond individuals and examines the culture that enabled all of this. Commentators reflect on how hip-hop historically rewarded dominance and discouraged vulnerability. Questioning power was often framed as betrayal. Loyalty was prized over accountability. The documentary doesn't assign blame, it explains conditions. Those conditions, it argues, are changing. Digital records don't fade. Old interviews resurface. Archived footage gains new relevance. The audience doesn't need to be persuaded anymore. They connect dots instinctively. This shift, the documentary suggests, is what makes the current moment different from every previous cycle of controversy. By the time this chapter reaches its end, the viewer understands that the situation has moved beyond personalities. This is no longer about whether Rick Ross clarifies his position or whether Diddy breaks his silence. It's about how institutions, once comfortable with ambiguity, respond when ambiguity becomes risk. The documentary leaves the audience with a quiet but unsettling realization. What's unfolding now isn't reaction, it's preparation. Preparation for deeper scrutiny, preparation for legal outcomes, preparation for narratives that can no longer be managed the way they once were. And as the pressure continues to tighten, the story approaches its final phase where consequence, not speculation, takes center stage. And the industry is forced to confront what happens when silence finally stops working. That final phase arrives without ceremony, and that's what makes it hit harder. By now, the documentary has stripped away the noise, the personalities and the distractions. What remains is consequence, not spectacle, not outrage. Consequence that unfolds slowly, unevenly, and in ways no single person fully controls anymore. The film returns to the present moment where the industry is no longer asking what happened, it's asking what happens next. Legal experts explain that once scrutiny reaches this level, outcomes don't hinge on one clip or one statement. They hinge on accumulation, patterns, documentation. Decisions made years ago that now sit under a different light. This is where power dynamics quietly reverse. Those who once benefited from distance now feel exposed by it. For Sean Diddy Combs, that shift is unmistakable. The documentary emphasizes again that allegations are not verdicts and that legal processes must run their course. But it also makes a crucial distinction. The court of law and the court of culture move differently. One requires proof beyond doubt. The other responds to doubt itself. And once doubt becomes persistent, it reshapes how legacy is discussed regardless of outcomes. Former associates reflect on how Diddy's influence once felt immovable, not because he spoke loudly, but because he didn't have to speak at all. In this final stretch, that silence feels heavier than ever. Not damning, but consequential. Silence no longer preserves authority the way it once did. It invites interpretation, and interpretation spreads. Rick Ross's position resolves differently, but not comfortably. The documentary makes clear that Ross isn't portrayed as collapsing or being erased. Instead, he's shown navigating a narrowing space. Analysts explain that credibility under scrutiny doesn't implode, it constricts. Choices feel heavier. Responses feel riskier. Even doing nothing becomes a decision with consequences. In an industry built on momentum, hesitation leaves marks. Behind the scenes, executives describe a prolonged recalibration. Not panic, not punishment caution. Projects move forward with extra layers of review. Partnerships require more justification. Risk managers step in earlier than they used to. One insider describes it as the cost of uncertainty. Not cancellation, not condemnation, just friction everywhere. And hovering over all of it is 50 Cent's role. Finally clarified. The documentary is deliberate in how it handles this final portrayal. It is careful not to simplify the story into heroes and villains. It doesn't crown 50 Cent as a savior, and it doesn't frame him as a rival chasing revenge or settling old scores. Instead, it presents him as a catalyst, someone who understood a hard truth about power that many people in the industry avoid acknowledging. Systems rarely collapse when they're challenged head-on. They adapt, deflect, and protect themselves. Real change only happens when pressure disrupts equilibrium just enough that maintaining the status quo becomes more costly than adjusting to it. People close to 50 Cent suggest that this was never about humiliation, embarrassment, or exposure for exposure's sake. There was no desire to create a spectacle or to dominate headlines for a brief moment. What motivated this release, they say, was exhaustion with stagnation. For years, stories circulated quietly. Questions lingered unanswered. Narratives survived not because they were resolved, but because they were protected by influence, by silence, and by an industry that benefited from not looking too closely. One precisely timed release achieved what years of public arguments, interviews, and debates never could. It shifted leverage. And once leverage shifts, behavior follows. From there, the film widens its lens for the final time, stepping back from individual names and asking a larger question. What does this moment mean beyond 50 Cent, Sean Diddy Combs, and Rick Ross? Cultural commentators reflect on how hip-hop and entertainment more broadly is being forced into a period of reckoning. For decades, myth often outweighed documentation. Image carried more weight than accountability. Loyalty was praised, even when it meant silence. Now, those values are colliding with an era where records don't disappear, footage resurfaces, and narratives can be re-examined long after they were assumed settled. The documentary does not claim that the industry has fully changed. It doesn't suggest that accountability has suddenly replaced protection or that power no longer shields those who hold it. Instead, it makes a quieter, more unsettling argument. The industry can no longer pretend that change isn't necessary. The old methods still exist, but they are under strain. Silence no longer guarantees safety. Distance no longer ensures immunity. And narratives that don't add up are no longer ignored as easily as they once were. As the final minutes unfold, there is a noticeable absence of dramatics. No sweeping montage of headlines, no definitive verdict, no narrator declaring winners and losers. Instead, the story circles back to the idea that has quietly threaded through every phase of the documentary: timing. Stories don't surface the moment they become true. They surface when conditions allow them to matter. And in this case, those conditions were built slowly, over years. They were built through unchallenged narratives that hardened into accepted truth, through deferred questions that felt inconvenient to ask, through power structures that assumed permanence and mistook longevity for legitimacy. What has changed isn't just visibility, it's tolerance. The tolerance for silence has diminished. The tolerance for ambiguity has narrowed. And the tolerance for stories that don't align with the record has weakened. The final voices heard are not accusatory or triumphant. They are reflective. People speak about regret not necessarily for what they did, but for what they didn't question sooner. They talk about opportunities to ask harder questions when the stakes felt lower, and about the cost of waiting until pressure made avoidance impossible. One commentator puts it simply: regardless of how courts rule or how legal processes unfold, the industry itself has already shifted. Conversations that once felt off limits are now unavoidable. Topics that were quietly sidestepped are now openly discussed. The documentary ends without closure by design. Closure implies finality, and this story is still in motion. Investigations continue. Reputations evolve. Alliances adjust. Power recalibrates. What feels different now is not the presence of conflict, but the absence of denial. The industry is no longer pretending nothing is happening. For Sean Diddy Combs, the future remains legally unresolved and culturally contested. His legacy, once discussed almost exclusively through success and influence, now exists alongside scrutiny that cannot be dismissed as temporary noise. For Rick Ross, credibility operates under a microscope it had not faced before, not erased, but examined. And that examination carries weight. And for 50 Cent, this documentary solidifies his role as someone who understood exactly when to speak and when silence would do more than any explanation ever could. What lingers after the screen fades isn't outrage or shock. It's awareness. Awareness of how power actually operates behind the scenes. Awareness of how narratives are protected, repeated, and normalized. And awareness of how quickly everything can change once those protections begin to weaken. Because the most important revelation in this documentary isn't found in any single recording, clip, or exchange. It's found in the realization that the system functioned exactly as it was designed to until the pressure became too great to ignore. If you stayed with this story until the end, Make sure to subscribe to The Hidden Evidence for more in-depth, documentary-style breakdowns, where we follow the details others rush past. And let me know in the comments, do moments like this genuinely change the culture? Or does the industry always find a way to reset and move on?